Hi, Iko.
Iko's also in the house.
Oh, there it is. Cousin Brian. That's Kevin of Office Duty.
I got it.
Okay, so this is Juan Jose. That's how I'm going to introduce this. He was our first student who requested a special course on civilization. He is, this is my son, Tim. This is his wife, Karen. And Juan Jose is Karen's brother and the uncle of Juan Cheese. And the nephew and uncle learned English 10 years ago, visiting Tim and Karen in Washington, D.C., and they learned it from this guy. They learned it from watching The Office. And this is my second cousin. And when Juan Jose was down in San Diego visiting, my first cousin was also there, and he brought with him his son, Kevin, who taught Juan Jose how to speak English on the TV series. And his name is Brian. It's not Kevin. And so it was so funny. He was so starstruck that when he introduced himself, he said, "Hello, I'm Karen's sister." Not to be left out is Jeremy and Zachary with second cousin Brian growing up. All right, so here we are. This is the stands, and are they a peaceful core? Right here, sitting in the middle of a ring of protest. Ramsey pointed out that Afghanistan should certainly close this ring. And in the middle, Mongolia is no longer protest-free. They are in Ulaanbaatar protesting in the streets. And the government says it's investigating a massive coal heist. The revenues of coal mined in Mongolia are shared with the population. So they're clustering around Genghis himself, and they're in the streets, and you can read all about it in this article. The other thing that I thought was interesting in the Silk Road Circle was Xi Jinping, in a rare admission, admits he's worried. This is very, very different than the tone we've heard from him before. So there's a sense that something may be changing in China. And in fact, there's already a book out called China is an Autocracy with Democratic Characteristics, which is kind of strange. Ezra Klein interviews the authoress today. So this is hot off the press. And Iko heard it. What's your verdict?
Well, I mean, she's presenting a nice view so that we can understand China, because we are not trying to understand China, we're trying to control it.
Okay. So an interesting point of view. We could be talking about that in future weeks. And then this is another book review that I thought was worth a minute. How Asia Found Herself. And the book review is written with a provocative lead. This is a Chinese Malaysian comedian, and he says, "I know you're excited that Sunak is the first Asian prime minister of Britain, but let's be clear, Indians are not Asians." So off we go. And this book article asks who gets to define what Asia means. And they point out this is right down the alley of Frankopan and heightening our sense of what was going on the Silk Road. And can we even call it Asia? The term only appeared in the 1600s on European maps, and it was in the context of empire. And what do Asians call themselves? Many different things. And they've been struggling to make sense of each other, according to the book. So in the shadow of Frankopan and the Silk Road that Ramsey introduced us to, I thought that was worth a mention. Also worth a mention is a new museum. The exhibition is entitled Alexander the Great and the Birth of the Modern World. And it brings up interesting questions about Hellenistic society. And the exhibition points out that Alexander is revered by many people, the Turks, the Arabs, the Persians. Iskander is a popular name, and we ran into it, Iskander, a lot when we were doing the history of the Pashtuns. And of course, Kandahar itself is named after Alexander. And so they focus saying that the Hellenistic world is what really forged modern attitudes and a distinctive urban society. It wasn't Athens, it wasn't democratic, but it had well-functioning institutions, many languages, ethnic diversity, civic pride, and the most creative synthesis of cultures the world has ever seen is the assertion. And of course, I'm sure Ramsey will have something to say about that.
Where is this new museum on Alexander?
In Athens.
In Athens.
Let's leave tomorrow.
Yeah, there you go. So they point out that the Greek city-states really didn't last that long in terms of millennia. It had been exhausted by fighting with Sparta. But together on the Silk Road came Christianity and Buddhist culture, arguably. And my favorite civilization, which Ramsey always chuckles about, are the Kushans. They were the Indo-Greek kings who held sway and propagated Buddhism, of all things. And you could argue that Buddhism, by this mechanism, influenced Judeo-Christian tradition. Of course, the article talks about the people that dispute all this, but I thought it was a provocative point of view for just another thing that reading Frankopan prepared me for. Okay, so back to Crimea. Dan wrote in that last week's session made him curious about Romanian history. And well, it should, because here's modern day Romania. And you'll remember last week on the edge of the Black Sea, we were talking about all other kinds of things. The Ottoman Empire that fought with Russia, Wallachia, the Austro-Hungary, Bessarabia, Moldavia, and the Danube. Which was always a mystery to me until we started reading about the Vikings in Kiev and how in the world did they get over to Regensburg? Well, it was on the Danube. So, and we learned that in the Balkan War, there was a lot of activity. In the Crimean War, we learned there was a lot of activity in the Balkans. Crimea is going to have the final battle, but United States troops are currently in Romania. And here's a headline. We're sending a signal to Moscow. We have troops here, the same place where the Crimean War started. 4,000 members. They've been there for 6 months. They just got extended for another 9 months. They're a tripwire, a NATO tripwire, quite near the Crimea. And there's a 2-star general there, along with his military planners. And guess what? They've got HIMARS defense systems that we've been reading so much about in Ukraine. They've been rolled through the streets of Bucharest. All right, back to 1854. Last week we talked about advances during the Crimean War. One of them, and we left off with modern nursing, Shigeko. We see also that the first military use of railways, telegraphs, and then there's this something terrible, this hollow bullet that does more damage for some reason to human flesh than filled bullets. So the Crimean War, a lot of fighting in the Balkans, but it's going to end in the siege of Sevastopol, where the Allies take it to Russia's home base, which is right here. We learned last week, and I think I showed you this map last week as well, the topography of Crimea. And we learned also last week that this is a national preserve, that there are Greek ruins here, and that had been used as a rationale for the Russians to claim that Vladimir had been baptized here, and therefore let's put in a naval base. This is what it looks like from the air, a natural harbor, a beautiful natural harbor. And the Greek ruins, just a review from last week, pre-Byzantine. So the siege of Sevastopol, the French were really the ones that did the heavy lifting in Sevastopol after a year-long siege. Here are the Russian defenders on the top of the hill. You can see an Orthodox priest, very much part of presiding like they are today with the Russian troops. This is what the Russians saw as the French tried to come up. This is what the French saw as they looked up at the Russians. This shows how complicated the movements were, but it all centered at the very end in Sevastopol. Jim pointed out when last week I asserted that the war was really determined in the Baltic with the blockade of the use of the Åland Islands after they were British captured them from the Russians. Jim did a little homework and found that the Åland Islands were part of the League of Nations agreement. And they were given some sort of autonomy. They have a special status in the EU, and though it belongs to Finland, as pointed out last week, the official language is Swedish. So thank you, Jim. So hand-to-hand combat, really nasty stuff. The timeline for the end of the siege, the British and the French are there. It's the French that are right at Sevastopol itself. And Tsar Nicholas catches the flu and dies. And so that might have something to do with the timeline. And a scant 8 months later, the British and the French capture Sevastopol, ending the war. Alexander II succeeds and says, okay, we're going to make some changes. The armistice is finally signed at the Treaty of Paris. The Black Sea becomes neutral, no warships. Ottoman independence is respected. That's what the British wanted, because they wanted to be sure that Russia didn't get a stranglehold on the Bosphorus and somehow threaten their empire. The Ottomans had to say that non-Muslims had rights, and some of that has to do with managing the holy city of Jerusalem. And the Ottomans got back Moldavia and Wallachia, where the war started. Russia takes over, protecting or yields protecting Christians over in favor of France. So they become the guardians of Jerusalem. Russia loses a third of Bessarabia, and the Danube was neutralized. Russia had captured the mouth of it, but they were given free rein in the Caucasus, interestingly enough, and that plays out in Putin's time in Chechnya. These are the dignitaries in Paris. Russia keeps a right to the forts along the Azov Sea, which we are all familiar with now, but it gave up its navy in the Black Sea, not allowed to keep forts along the Black Sea, and they couldn't go back to the Aland Islands. The death toll. This is, you can see France takes second place by far over Turkey and Great Britain. Russia takes the brunt, and we think of it as a British war, but the French were there big time. So consequences, arguably, serfdom is abolished and the army's reformed, like it's being reformed now, I suppose. History repeats itself. Other consequences, the isolation of Austria-Hungary. They make some make the case that there was a war fever in Britain that wanted to continue the war, but finally the horror of the war makes it into the newspapers, and the war, the popularity of the war falls. We've already talked about nursing, and for the first time, Britain and France are fighting on the same side. But there's a mythic element, and there's a mythic element today, arguably. The truth of the matter, the Highlanders, or the original thin red line, it was a pretty straightforward victory to the south of Sevastopol and those highlands. It was a prelude to the Battle of Balaclava, which we're familiar with because of Alfred Lord Tennyson's charge of the Light Brigade. But the fog of war, which we know about from Vietnam and Robert McNamara and the great documentary by the same name, was different than the myth. So where is Baklava? It's to the south of Sevastopol, and the invasion and the horses came up from there. This is what Baklava Harbor looked like in 1830. And remember Baklava Harbor, because it's going to come up again in Soviet times. So what do I mean by the fog of war? The argument has already been made that that's the charge of the light brigade. Well, the charge of the heavy brigade had already been successful, and the charge of the light brigade was a mistake, the wrong order. It was unnecessary. They charged the length of the valley for really no reasons. The battle had already been won, but the Russian battery said, well, what the hell, what are they doing? And 278 casualties, which is a third of their whole unit. And it inspired this unnecessary charge, inspired the charge of the light brigade. And initially, the historians, after a couple of decades, say that was a wasted sacrifice. But there's a revision. There's a lot of revisionist history that pops up. And the revision is, well, you know what? They were so brave, and it so horrified the Russians that the Brits would do this sober. Apparently, the Russians needed a drink before battle. And that in and of itself unnerved the Russian cavalry. And that's what made them retreat as much as the charge of the heavy brigade. So the actual, despite the myth, the actual fighting was awful, just awful. The larger context, the Ukraine, arguably this whole episode gave a boost to Ukrainian nationalism, because all three imperial powers impinging on the Ukraine were weakened through war, and the coup de grace would come in World War I, where all three empires would fall. I want to turn to the Tatars, because they play a big role. We've already talked about the origin of the Tatars. I'm just going to review it real quick. It's an umbrella term for Turkic ethnic groups who went into league with Genghis Khan and the Mongol Empire, and helped rule and collect taxes in the Golden Horde area, where the successors to Genghis set up one of the three succeeding empires. But Tatari is a larger term that applies to the northern and central steppes, but it's often conflated with Genghis Khan and the Mongols themselves. From the Russians' point of view, they got tired of collecting taxes for the Tatar representatives of Genghis Khan, and finally Ivan rebelled and defeated the Tatars in Kazan, the area of Kazan, which is to the east of Moscow. Some Tatars fled to Crimea, and that's why we're talking about them. But a lot of them stayed and became a semi-autonomous khanate, and mixed with noble families. And here's a guy that had Tatar links, specifically Kalmyk. He also was part Jewish. So I think those two together amounted to an eighth. The largest group still in Russia are the Volga Tatars, and the 5 million. Eiko and I met one on our trip to Lithuania. He was a Tatar from Moscow that was vacationing there. Let's pick up the Tatar history where we left off. You'll remember Potemkin, Catherine's lover and general, finally expelled the Tatars from Crimea. That is, they expelled the Tatar upper class, the ruling class, but still, the share of the general population was 80% Tatar. Even by the end of the Crimean War. But then Alexander II, who succeeds Nicholas I, foments an era of Russian nationalism. Sound familiar? And the Tatar share of the Crimean population was gradually diluted. By whom? Some of the Russian colonial settlers were those serfs that had been freed at the end of the Crimean War, possibly because of the Crimean War. Even some Ukrainians eager for land took over Tatar land in the name of a shared religion that they had with their fellow Orthodox Russians. By the turn of the century, 800,000 Tatars had been forced to leave, and we're going to see Stalin completed the cleansing. And here is
Question. John,
yeah.
when did Ukraine become a term of, you say the Ukrainians, but I haven't heard or seen on a map Ukraine mentioned prior to this?
I'm gonna say somewhere in the Cossack era, where there was some local pride, but that's just a guess. I'll research that.
It happened during the Polish-Lithuanian Empire, yeah, probably.
Okay.
Relatively far back, I think. I
Yeah.
mean, far back as in 17th century.
Yeah, and it was
Bob, yeah, I mean, I seem to recall that somebody was mentioned that Ukraine really means borderlands,
Yeah.
like a mark, Denmark, etc. And that maybe it was just a general geographic term. I mean, reasonably early on, I don't know, but it means borderlands.
yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah, correct. And that's why we politically correct all had to learn to stop saying the Ukraine, because that meant borderland secondary to Russia, and say Ukraine simply. But as I said, Ukraine nationalism took off at the end of the Crimean War because of the weakening of the other powers. So somewhere between 1650 and 1850, Jim, we could narrow it down even more. But I picked 1650 because that's when the local Cossacks decided to rebel against the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and go into league with Russia. And Peter the Great eventually tried to build on that and thought he had good, solid Cossack allies when he fought against Sweden. But we know that those Cossacks were fickle, and they turned their back on Peter, at least some of them. And because the Cossacks weren't really united, I mean, they were warlords, And we've seen pictures of them, and they weren't particularly reliable political allies. Okay, so moving ahead to post-World War I, the deck gets totally reshuffled. And the Crimean Tatars that are still left there said, hey, as long as the deck's shuffled, let's come up with a Tatar Crimean People's Republic. And we'll be the Muslim center. But the Bolsheviks said, nah, and they captured Crimea, and they captured the independence leader and killed him without trial and threw him into the Black Sea. And so these are the Red Terror in Crimea that put down this attempt by the Crimeans to achieve some autonomy. Even so, by 1939, there was still a strong presence of Crimeans sprinkled, it's interesting, around the periphery. But that's going to change because Stalin, during World War II, got it in his head that the Crimean Tatars had been cooperating with the Nazis, that there were Nazis in Crimea, just like there are Nazis today in Ukraine, according to Putin. And so he loaded them all on trains, which has been called an act of genocide by many, and sent them to Uzbekistan, which was here's your Islamic place where you can go. And this shows the concentration of Tatars throughout the Russian world now, but it's most intense in Uzbekistan, Ukraine, and Turkey itself, because of the traditional alliance between the Ottomans and the Tatars. And that one reason they went to Crimea was the Ottomans controlled Crimea, and that was a safe sanctuary. So Stalin returns to the scene of the crime at Yalta. Where's Yalta? Here's Yalta, right here. And I was there. This was from a bus in 1962. I'm traveling with a group of German socialist students on a goodwill tour of Russia. And this is one of our stops. We camped out. And I took this picture of the beach at Yalta. Some of these women were topless, which was quite remarkable to a junior at Stanford.
Who fell into the water and dropped his camera.
That's another story. That's another story. I'll be glad to tell that later.
Yeah, when Ika's not in the room, that's right.
On the way to Yalta, though, we had the good fortune of hitting Moscow when they were welcoming a cosmonaut home. And I took this photo with my Minox camera, which was a little pocket camera, which certainly could have gotten me 20 years today. And that's Khrushchev himself. This is 2 months before the Cuban Missile Crisis. This is a snap of those behind me, and this is me. Okay, remember Balaclava that I mentioned back in 1830? So this is going to be an important place for the Soviets in Crimea. They're building on their a naval use of Crimea. So you can see Balaclava is to the south, and the Sevastopol's up here. And they built this massive secret submarine base where they kept their submarines safe from nuclear attack. Today, it's a museum open to tourists. I don't know how many tourists are getting to Crimea these days. Khrushchev finally, he gives government, the governing of Crimea to the Ukraine Soviet in 1954. And he finally gets around to Tatar policy, and he apologizes for what Stalin did. He apologized for a lot of what Stalin did, but one of them was shipping out the Tatars, but he didn't allow them to come back home. He wasn't that sorry, and there were still a lot of empty homes. And you're going to see that Tatars do return to some of these homes. In 1991, when the Soviet Union has fallen, Crimeans get a vote. Do you want to be part of the Soviet Union, or are you for Ukrainian independence? Overall, in the Ukraine, had former Ukraine Soviet, or Ukrainia, I guess, 90% said, "No, we're for independence." In Crimea, the majority were, but by much less, and that's because of the Russian naval presence. And the Tatars see this as a green light to start coming back, and they start coming back the year after. And they to court them, Ukraine builds a Tatar memorial site, decrying the genocide of Stalin, and by 2001, you've got a rising percent of the population that's Tatar. They came and tried to reclaim the land that had been taken from them 50 years before, but without much success. And we see that same thing happening in Palestine and in Israel. And the Ukraine, though, granted Crimea some autonomy within the country of Ukraine. And by 2004, the Crimean population had risen to 12% Tatars. Which is quite a recovery, and I think a testimony to homesickness, the historical memory of living in Crimea, and what a place it is, historical and geographical. The Russians, though, they had an abiding interest in their Crimean investment. And so there was a treaty that was negotiated in 1997 between Russia and Ukraine. This is Yeltsin time. This is before Putin takes over. And they agreed to divide the Black Sea Fleet between them. Which is remarkable given events today. And given events today, Russia recognized Ukraine's legitimate hold on all the land in Crimea, including Sevastopol, which had always had a special status. and they got a temporary 20-year lease, which that would have been expired in 2017, but something happened in 2013, before the Maidan and before the little green men, there was a New Deal. And it was going to give Sevastopol to Russia until 2042. And what did Ukraine get? It got a 30% discount on natural gas. At that point, Sevastopol became a federal city within Ukraine. So it wasn't exactly part of Crimea anymore. It had a special status apart in the Constitution, which you'll remember later in the Minsk agreements, Russia was seeking a similar deal for Donbass and Luhansk. And the how's my time, my dear?
It's 10 minutes till 3.
At 10 minutes till 3. Okay, so in one analysis, the unique mixture in Crimea was acknowledged, and as Timothy Snyder points out, it still was a crossroads, even more so than Ukraine itself. But the important thing is the geography. How easy is it to separate Crimea from the landmass of the steppes that it's attached to? And that's going to come up in just a second, because right at this moment, they're united with Ukraine. There's many different polls that have been taken. What is the sentiment of Crimea? And I'm going to say they're contradictory. There's no unified agreement. This is a poll done the Kiev Post, and it showed that Crimea saw Ukraine as a motherland increasingly after the Maidan revolution. This guy is a scholar. I'm going to mention him in the same context of Timothy Snyder. He's from Cambridge. Aiko.
Yeah, so the Tatars are 12% Crimea. What are the Russians and the Ukrainians? What percentage?
I'll get to that. I'll get to that. It's less now. So, you know, just like there've been changing facts on the ground in Israel, the last 8 years have seen changing facts on the ground. And so that's going to influence a lot of this. So some of this data and some of what Rory Finnan presents is older data. He was interviewed on Ukraine the Latest, the Telegraph podcast, which I think is the best of all the podcasts. I think it's better than the BBC podcast. But he talks about this definitive public opinion survey done in 2013, a year before the Maidan. And you can see U.S. aid had its hands in this, as did another group of NGOs. And the question was, this is 2013, what do you consider yourself? And you can see that Russia is the leading category, but it's decreasing. It's decreasing. Not by huge amounts, but it is decreasing. This is too much detail. Unsurprisingly, there's variation on ethnicity. 63% of Russians saw themselves as Russian, and 66% of Ukraine saw themselves in Crimea as Ukrainian, and the Tatars were 100% believing that Crimea belonged to them. This is the regional breakdown, which we'll skip. But there's some contradictory stuff. So here's a question. If Ukraine was able to enter only one international economic union, which should it be? The people in Ukraine as a whole said the EU, and that led to the Maidan revolt. But in Ukraine, I'm sorry, in Crimea, the prevailing sentiment was a customs union with Russia and Belarus and Kazakhstan. And this is Putin's a version of the EU. So that's interesting. And how would you evaluate your attitude to the following entities? Well, the people of Russian ethnicity felt warm to Russians, and the attitudes towards the EU was neutral, with only 14%. So this kind of reflects the contradictory point of the last one. You can see the percentage of people that felt warm to Americans was only 6% in Crimea. And the question also came up, how's Ukraine, because this was part of Ukraine in 2013, how are they doing in solving the Tatars problem? And you can see just barely a majority thought they were doing okay with the Tatars. They were making an attempt, the Ukrainians were. This is the ethnicity the people identified in Crimea, almost 60% Russian. Ukrainian ethnicity, this is independent of the political feelings, was 20%, and around 15% Crimea, which is what we thought. But even more, 82% spoke Russian at home. That would reflect some Ukrainians speaking Russian. There's more. I thought that was sufficient detail without overwhelming you, but there's more contradictory stuff on loyalty. This is another study from Great Britain, which asked this question. And their conclusion was that most people identified themselves as Crimean. Younger people did not go along with that. So there's a age split. Younger people tended to identify as Ukrainian, according to this second report. These young people in particular thought that Russian citizenship was inaccessible, undesirable, illegitimate, and illegal. And at that point, this study says Russian citizenship failed to offer much in the way of rights that people wanted are needed. They respected Ukrainian laws. Only a minority of even pro-Russian parties wanted actual Russian citizenship. And the thing that clouds all this is corruption. the Russian parties in particular were corrupt. Yankovich was seen as being corrupt, his political party, and that was, of course, the sentiment in 2014 at the Maidan revolt. And so they saw most pro-Russian politics as being just part of organized crime. Then came 2014, and the little green men came marching in. The Maidan revolt in Kiev was success, and Putin's response was, "Okay, you're not gonna join this economic union that Yankovich." Yankovich had reversed himself. He had said he was going to sign an agreement with the EU, and then Putin twisted his arm, offered him a better deal, and he said, "No, we're going to go with this larger economic union of the former Soviet states." And that's when everything broke loose in Kiev, and Putin said, "If you're gonna do that, I'm taking Crimea," and he put in charge, talking about corruption, this guy. So how are we doing on time?
3:00.
So it's 3:00. I'm gonna. This is a good place to stop. I think I can finish the story pretty quick before, not today, but next week before Ramsey takes over, and gets us back to California, as I said earlier. I sent around a YouTube that Ramsey has recommended to get us back into the mood of what's going on in Europe between the Moorish occupation of Spain and the age of discovery, and he's going to refresh our memory and see what kind of mindset the Spaniards bought when Coronado came up and explored our wonderful California. So I'm gonna stop here and see if there's any comments or questions.
Well,
Well,
John,
it's used- yeah, go ahead. I'll shut up.
I probably should raise my hand, sorry, up here. Anyway, what is the makeup of Turkey? What proportion of the population are Tatar in Turkey? And what's the relationship between Kurds and Tatars?
Well, Kurds are, correct me if I'm wrong, Ramsey, I think Kurds are Indo-European, for one thing, as opposed to Turks. I'm sorry, as opposed to
Tatars.
as opposed.
So what are the other groups that make up Turkey?
Well, there's, I think it's 20% Kurdish, correct me if I'm wrong. And Erdogan, he had, when he first came to power, had made an alliance with, what have I done? Okay, he had made an alliance with the Kurds. And that lasted for a good while. So that 20% gave him a really healthy majority. But that didn't last. There are still Armenians in positions of influence, I think, in the economy. There are even Greeks in the economy. Ramsey's been to Istanbul fairly recently, so I'm going to yield the floor, Ramsey.
Oh, you expect me to give an answer here? My response would be that the Turkish, and maybe this is a view of the future too, that the Turkish ability, especially under Ataturk, to get people to claim Turkish loyalty was enormous. And so regardless of what the DNA of any of these people are, there's the vast majority of people in Turkey identify as Turks. And those that aren't, that clearly aren't, like Greeks, the few Greeks or few Jews or few ever that are left there are more than happy to be in Istanbul and be part of what had been a thriving economy. Right now, it's a mess. But Kurds is a different story. And the hotel this little place hotel we stayed in Istanbul, turned out that the guys working at the desk were Kurds, which was wonderful. And we finally had the guts to ask some pretty nasty, well, what seemed to us nasty questions. Said, no, we'll be happy to talk about this. We love being part of Turkey. And we're sick and tired of the Turkish independent movement, who is making things tough on us. We're doing better here than we would be doing in a so-called Turkestan. And so we left scratching our heads and thinking, what the hell? God, do we read the newspaper anymore, or is it that confusing? And apparently it is that confusing. But the question is legitimate. All sorts of other people in other areas of the world, like oh, come on, old man. The breakaway part of Georgia that the Russians now claim, Abkhazia, where Caesareans used to live. I mean, the Russians were successful at massive imports of those people, just throwing them out of what had been Georgia in their homeland for 300 years. They were forced into Turkey. Now, whether they identify as Turks these days or not, I have no idea. But the Turkish loyalty got pretty impressive. And I would then argue that we will have to wait and see about Crimea. These are all projects anymore. I've been spending probably way too much time reading about the ethnic identity of the so-called identity, not necessarily DNA reality of people in Central Asia. We're going there. And that is a total work in progress that is evolved after World War I, evolved after World War II, evolved after independence. It's a movable feast. And what people say in a survey certainly has nothing to do with their DNA. It has to do with other sorts of things. I guess you could say the same thing about Alabama's identification of American or Southerner these days. I don't know. It's all strange stuff. This identification of what nationality you are.
Yeah. Language is somehow a tip-off, but as we say in Crimea, not always.
Exactly.
As we see in the Luhansk and Donetsk, not always.
Or in that's another small example. We were in Armenia two years before, and the Armenians more or less out of pure realism say we have to be allies to the Russians. We don't necessarily want to be allies to the Russians, but we have to be. We can't defend ourselves. We can't defend ourselves from Azerbaijan or the Turks. The other people that will legitimately defend us and happily defend us are the Russians. So we're happy to have Russian troops here because they're the only ones that will defend us. Now, they're not doing it right now because of the mess that Putin has gotten himself into in the Ukraine. And therefore, Azerbaijan is reattacking Nagorno-Karabakh because the Russians aren't there to defend the Armenians over there. And God, good Lord. I mean,
yeah, and the interesting link there is Christianity, right? So
of course,
you throw in language and you throw in religion, and
we're surrounded by Azerbaijani Islam. We're surrounded by Turkish Islam. So we'll even though we're not Orthodox Christians in Armenia, we're at least Christians, and they are too. And we don't know what to make of the Georgians. I mean, so Asia, I don't know, ethnicity, I don't know. It seems to me all of these are very strange concepts. And it's so fascinating to ask the question, well, so when did all that happen, this conceptual stuff moving toward nationalism? And isn't that kind of a mess? Ask the British farmers who can't farm anymore because they can't get Poles to come and pick their vegetables, so they have to just leave the fields more or less fallow because the idiot, 52% of idiots said we're going to leave the EU. Yeah, that's not much of an answer, is it? It's just a bunch of questions.
No, that was good. That was great. Yeah, so it's complicated. So any other questions, comments?
One, good luck tomorrow, John. Good luck. Yeah. John's heading in for a little surgery tomorrow. So when we see him next, he'll be a new man.
I'll be replumbed.
Question.
Iko, question.
Do you remember that museum that we went to? It wasn't a castle, but it was a real fancy building, a major person's building. It was in Lithuania, and they had an exhibit of the Tatars, and they did mention and emphasize that they were tax collectors. And I'm wondering if, like, the Tatars were disliked in the same way as they collected taxes. Jews collected taxes.
Well, what I remember is the Jewish Museum in Warsaw. And there they talked about the rebellion of the Cossacks from Polish-Lithuania, and that the Jews had been recruited to Polish estates to collect taxes, because the Polish aristocracy, and Ramses made this point, they were not a very responsible lot, and they turned over the management of their farms and the collecting of taxes. And you think about that's going to create a lot of resentments, and of course the famous Cossack pogroms against Jews, right? So the Ukraine, and I think Snyder talks about this, going through his history of Ukraine and anti-Semitism. That's the one I remember, and that the Cossack rebellion of 1651 was heavily anti-Semitic. Heavily.
You mentioned this.
I don't remember that. Yeah. Okay. Anybody?
that settles that. Everything is clear as mud. Well done, John. That's a lot of good information. Thank you. Thank you.
But when we get to California, we're all experts.
Yeah, sure. Just kill the Indians off, and don't even let them be part of it.
Yes.
That. Yeah. Well, the revenge is fantastic with the gambling resorts. I just love it. Let these drunks come up here and spend their money.
Okay, folks. Very good.
Good luck tomorrow, John. Good luck.
All right. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.